Hello and welcome to this movie night review of the 2014 film that is The Purge, the prequel to the 2016 film that is The Purge Election Year, and the sequel to the 2013 film that is The Purge. So I'll go into it and have just a quick look at the film itself. So basically it's really different to the first film, the 2013 film The Purge, and it's probably more of an action film than a horror, if anything. And also it just has a very different approach in that it's not based around one house and one family. There's loads of different layers to the action, in that they're around the streets of LA, because people are basically sort of stuck there, and they're being hunted down. Like, we can see the way in which the Purge has violence in a number of different ways, like someone selling himself to be purged, people that have grievances, people who are professional purgers that just want to kill anybody, and people that make money out of it, and so on and so forth. So yeah, that's basically what we have. We should have loads of different parts of violence, with really, for the space of film that it is, fairly, quite a lot of characters, and that's one thing I'll go on to talk about. But I'll go and look at the positives, the plot holes, and the negatives of this film. So firstly, the positives. I think that it does have a decent lead performance from the guy that's, I believe, later labelled as the sergeant. Other than that, the acting doesn't really let down the film, in which it does, in a way, the first film that I talked about, the over-foreshadowing. The rest of it's all fairly standard, and it is a good performance from him. I think that there is a good bit of jump scare at the start. There's only one real bit of jump scare, and it's quite good when the guy comes up against the guy that's in the couple, when he can't get into his car. That's quite good. And then also, it's all, flows quite well in terms of the way in which they bring together the characters at the start to make them in the streets of LA. So that's the two people that are related, and the person that they know has just given them 100,000 each for, I believe it's their dad, who's given himself up to the Purge, and also the couple that we see at the start who have their issues. They're brought in together quite nicely, and that flows quite well. But I'll look at the plot holes now. And so the first thing is, there's a bit of an issue in that the car being damaged, that doesn't really make that much sense, because that's before the Purge and laws are still enforced. So how come they're very clearly there, and they're stalking them, and they've damaged their car? Wouldn't anyone in their right mind just call the police rather than, try and run away or get the AA, the American AA, out, or whatever they're trying to do? Also, there's a bit of an issue with how they, this whole enforcement of Class 4 weapons thing. How does some government thing randomly detect when a grenade is, and say, you will be prosecuted, and all that kind of stuff? That just, law enforcement aren't even an operation in The Purge, as it's stated in the first film. It just doesn't really make that much sense when they do that. And also, one thing that doesn't make that much sense, in terms of that it either shouldn't be in the film for me, or it should just be acknowledged, is how unemployment stated in the first film it's at 1% or below 1%, and in this one it's 5%, and that's a pretty big difference, and I think it raises quite considerable issues with the whole model of the Purge. And so I think it would probably make more sense if they just left it at 1%, but you can't really put that in and not even acknowledge it, especially with the politics that are in this film. And so yeah, no one really looks at that. And finally, one thing that's not so much a plot hole, but I really had to mention, was, why does the auction look so much like Hillary Clinton? It's just a bit weird. The person that's auctioning off the people to be killed. That's just a bit weird. But anyway, let's move on to the criticisms. So the first thing I'd like to point out is that the political commentary is just completely ridiculous and a complete waste of everybody's time, if you ask me. I think that what they have is they're trying to politicize this world that is just, it's so far apart. And I can see that obviously in literature and films you have a position in which there's a sort of analogy, or use things to demonstrate things that are in the real world, but they just don't really do that. The only thing you could take away from this that goes into the real world is that money can buy you protection, and money can buy you a lot of things, but money's the currency. That's just very, everyone understands that. That's just not really a unique point that's put across by the Purge, or the Purge Anarchy. It just doesn't really make that much sense. And overall, this whole, quite a lot of the build-up, probably the first half an hour or so, and bits that go into the film, are essentially about this whole politicizing of the Purge, and maybe that, I don't know. I haven't watched the third one. Maybe that will make a bit more sense then, but it should really be restricted to them, because in this film it just really doesn't come together well, and it's a complete waste of everybody's time. They're basically trying to put a clever political message, but it's into the film, but it's just not the right film to do that. It just, they should maybe finish this film and then do another film that, is clever and intelligent and political. Like, it really does not work in this film, and it simply shouldn't be there. Okay, so I'll go on to my second big criticism of this film, and that's that there's just too many characters and I guess too much going on, which basically means that it's very difficult to buy into this film, and subsequently it means that there's a bit of dead action, which basically just a clip of someone shooting someone with special effects wouldn't have really been that different, because that's just how little, I guess, investment it provides in the film, and how little you care about it, because they're just not really brought in that well, and the lack of context there is behind some of the violence. So I've got quite a few examples for this, and these are criticisms of the scenes themselves as well. So firstly, the whole bit where, the guy who says he's ill and then sacrifices himself, like, he's in the film for just a few minutes. What does he really contribute? I mean, I can see that there's some, maybe they're trying to acknowledge the different ways in which there's violence in the Purge, but I really don't know what it adds. Like, I just think that that's a pointless few minutes, and the film would be much better off spending that time in getting main characters to have a bit more recognition and a bit more context with them, rather than just showing someone who basically die. I just don't really see what that provides to the film. Another issue is the initial sort of violence against the two people who were related to the guy that I was just talking about. When someone comes out, I believe it's like a guard or someone that they walk past every day, as he puts it, and he just tries to kill them, but he gets shot. And this just doesn't really, it just doesn't make sense. I mean, he says that he's angry about how on a daily basis they just don't talk to him or something. Just why? Why couldn't you use that time again on bringing in more context? I think that in that part, it's like no one would be that angry about being ignored. I mean, it's a bit rude when someone blanks someone. It's not really a reason to vent the anger in the way that he does. It just doesn't really make that much sense. And again, I think that's just a way in which they're trying to add in another scene of violence for the sake of it. And it really feels very meaningless because of that. And it's just a bit of a waste of time for the film. And also I'd like to point out the bit at the end, in terms of when he's trying to get revenge for someone who was a drunk driver and killed his son. So obviously that's fair enough, but I think that given how the film is ultimately leading up to this, it really lacks more context in terms of why, and I guess just more sort of going into that. And also it would be good if it provided a bit more reason as to why he has decided to spare the guy. It just happens, and that, it just doesn't really add up. That bit doesn't make that much sense. So I'll carry on and look at another criticism of the film, and this is probably the lightest one I can think of, just because this is more a criticism of something that it would be a lot better if it did have, not something that, not a criticism of something that it already has. So that's that. It would be really good if it had more links to the first film. I saw in reading about the film that there's only one person that's in all three films of the Purge, and that's someone who in this film has a fairly minor role. He's a fellow politician. He was the guy who I think is Dwayne Bishop, a homeless guy who was saved in the previous film. And so yeah, I think when you think of all the issues there are, and that the characters, many of them just don't really have that much context, I think if you had ones that carried over a bit more, that would make the film have a bit more sense overall, and a bit, I think it would be a lot easier to buy into and be gripped by. But because they don't have that, it's just a bit of an issue. Also, one thing that, again, this is with this film trying to do too much, I think, sort of linked to the too many character thing that I mentioned earlier, this whole weird thing of the auction, not just the auction itself, but actually the thing that comes after that, where it's almost like, it looks like this weird cross between almost like a laser zone and a Hunger Games, where basically they can't see, the people that are hunting them obviously can, and this whole thing, it's really a very flawed scene. It just doesn't make sense. I mean, for one thing, the guy has no guns, he can't see. The people do have guns and they can see, and somehow he manages to kill 5 of them. Like, okay, it's a film, but please, that's just ridiculous. And it just, why, I just really don't see, because of how you have such low expectations that they're all going to die, I don't think that that really provides anything. You know, it just further sacrifices good jump scare that there was in the first film, and it really just doesn't add anything to the film especially. It just makes you sit there thinking, okay, so the characters aren't that believable, so I'm obviously not gripped in that way, and this is just sheer stupidity, so, you know, I can't really get into the film that much in this way, and so it just carries on to make that film that bit less gripping and that bit less enjoyable. And finally, my final criticism, possibly in a way the most important one, because I think if it did have this, it would have saved the film, because obviously the first one had quite a few, maybe not as many criticisms, but quite a lot of criticisms, but still got away with it for having this, and this is just that there just isn't any jump scare. Like The Purge, as a franchise, or at least from what I've seen in the first 2 films and from what I gather, it's not the kind of thing that really is supposed to, you know, creep you out massively, and be a sort of traditional horror thing. It's more sort of jump scare. It has a little bit of that in this film and quite a huge amount of it in the first film, but really saved it as a film. And there just isn't any, and it's more of an action film, which I think kind of goes against part of the franchise. And I think that because they don't have this, the film really doesn't have the saving grace it had in the first one. Of it is ultimately an entertaining film, and for all its flaws, you know, it can serve its purpose, and it doesn't. And when you think of all the other valid criticisms there are of the film, what I've gone through, and so it's not, you know, maybe the best film in terms of story and all the rest of it. The fact that it doesn't have anything to save it means that this really is a pretty poor film. So if I was to give it a rating out of 5 stars, I would have to give this film a 1 star, because it really, you know, it has a lot of issues and it doesn't really provide much. It's not that entertaining, if at all, and it really just is a very confused film with very, you know, little positives about it, frankly. Anyway, so I said after my first review that if you got over 3 likes, which you did, I would do a review of the next one, but with this one I think it will need a very significant response, because I'm not sure I can be bothered to watch the third film, because this one was shocking. Thank you for listening.